There's 100 different ways to cook ribs, and it seems that everyone claims to know the superior method. In this video, we're cutting out all the BS, and I'm going to show you one of the easiest and most common ways of making incredible barbecue ribs. Follow this simple process, and you will have made ribs that are practically as good as what you'd get at your local barbecue joint. And to keep things even simpler, we're going to be using store-bought spice rub and some store-bought barbecue sauce. But once you get the method down, you can start experimenting with your own homemade rubs and sauces and take your rib game to a whole new level. As for today, we're breaking this rib cook down into the most basic terms and the most simple steps. So let's get started. Here's the slab of ribs we'll be making today. These here are baby back ribs, and the first thing I'm going to do is pat them relatively dry with some paper towels. I'll mention that it doesn't really matter if you buy baby backs, St. Louis style, or full spare ribs. The cooking method is exactly the same, and the only real differences are how much you may choose to trim off and how long you may have to cook them for. For these baby backs, I'm going to do very little trimming. Basically, if there's any thin, dangly bits of meat, I'll slice those off, because they may get too crispy or even burnt during our long cook. The real competition grade ribs call for trimming off a lot more, because presentation seems to be as important as taste. But I don't want to trim off so much of the delicious meat, which is pretty much what happens if you have St. Louis style ribs. So all I'm really going to do is clean up the corners, square it up a bit, and the top ridge has this very thin flap of loose meat that I'm definitely going to trim off. And that's about it. Now let's talk about the membrane. Some people insist that you have to remove the membrane on the bone side. Some people don't do anything with it at all. In my experience, after a long, slow cook like we're doing today, this membrane is not even remotely going to matter. But a sort of middle ground option is to do the scoring method, which basically just means cutting shallow slits in a crosshatch pattern all across that membrane. Maybe it helps in some way, but honestly I don't notice much difference versus not doing anything with the membrane at all. And now it's time for the spice rub. Like I said, we're keeping it easy today, so I'm using some of this Rendezvous Memphis rub. I'll just start applying the rub all over every surface and side of this slab of ribs, and I don't bother with a binder or slather. Some people drown their ribs in yellow mustard or some other gross thing, and it's just not really needed. Raw meat is already moist, and the seasoning will adhere just fine. And I'll go on somewhat heavy, of course, making sure to get the sides and give it a few pats as I go to make sure that rub is sticking, and that's it. This thing is ready to start smoking. Now, something to mention for people who may not own a smoker, and that's that you can absolutely make these ribs practically the same way in your oven. There's really no difference, except your ribs aren't going to have any smoky flavor, but they're still going to be tender and amazing. One little tip though, if you are going to do it in the oven, put your rack of ribs on a wire rack and put that rack on the middle rack of your oven. And then on the rack beneath that rack, put some kind of tray or cookie sheet or something that'll catch all of the fat and juice drippings that are gonna come out of that rack of ribs, just to save yourself a huge mess inside of your oven. So I'll get some hardwood lump charcoal fired up, and then into the Oklahoma Joe offset it goes, along with a chunk of hardwood. I'll let this smoker come up to temperature, and that temperature today is 250 degrees Fahrenheit. Once we're at about 250 and I've got some nice clean looking smoke coming out of this thing, I'll put in the ribs. And of course I'll insert one of my thermometer probes so I'll know exactly when it's time to pull them out. And because this is a pretty small offset smoker, I'll make sure to put the ribs at the side furthest from the firebox just to make sure it doesn't get too much heat on one side. Now I'll just do my best to maintain the smoker at about 250 degrees for the next several hours until the internal temperature of the ribs reaches 180 degrees. Now, at this point in the cook, there's a couple different schools of thought. And I know I said that there's a million ways that people do this, and we're going to break it down into the most simplest steps. But right now is the time when you kind of have to make a decision. And that's, do you want your ribs to be cooked with some barbecue sauce on them? Or do you want the more traditionalist or purist style of rib where there's no sauce applied until maybe when you're eating and you can dip it into a little cup of sauce as you see fit? So again, that's to sauce or not to sauce. I like them both ways, but most of the time I like some of the sauce to be cooked on there. I'm in Michigan, and we don't really have the same sort of level of barbecue purist or fanaticism that you might see in Texas or Memphis, even though this is sort of a Memphis style of rib that I'm doing. Up north, we don't really have the same barbecue history, so I kind of feel like we don't necessarily have the same barbecue judgmentalism, if that's a word. That is to say, we make it however we think is going to taste the best. Anyway, in this particular video with this particular rack of ribs, we're going to do the method that includes putting some barbecue sauce on it. And now that my ribs have reached an internal temperature of 180 degrees, that step is happening now. So I'll pull out the thermometer probe and remove my ribs from the smoker. I'll lay them out on 2 layers of aluminum foil, bone side down for the moment, so I can apply my barbecue sauce. I'm just using some regular old Sweet Baby Ray's, but use whatever sauce you want. I'll give that sauce a quick rub to distribute it over the top and sides of the meat, and then flip the ribs over so the meat side is down, before tightly wrapping it all up in the foil. Having the sauce and meat facing down at this point will let the meat almost sort of braise in the sauce and juices, making it even more tender during the rest of this cook. And by the way, if you don't want to do the sauce thing, just wrap the ribs up in foil without sauce, and otherwise do this all exactly the same way. Now I'm going to kick up the smoker temp to 275 degrees and continue cooking until the internal meat temp reaches 200. Okay, a little while later and our ribs are done cooking, and before I do anything else, I have to let them rest for 20 to 30 minutes. So I'll just leave them here on the counter and stare at the clock until then. And it's finally time to unwrap these things and start digging in. And I'd say that's a pretty delicious looking slab of ribs right there. They're probing very tender, and they smell absolutely incredible. Sure, I could have trimmed more of the meat off to make the whole thing look a little more symmetrical, but why wouldn't I want to keep that extra meat for the purposes of shoving it into my face? Anyway, let's slice them up. In hindsight, I probably should have used a different knife, because these ribs are so tender, just the pressure of sliding my knife through them caused a few to start pulling apart and looking less than perfect for my YouTube thumbnail. But oh well, I can't really be too mad about that, especially when I take a closer look at one of these juicy, meaty, smoky, incredible baby back ribs. So there you have it. Juicy, tender, amazing, sticky, saucy, beautiful rack of pork baby back ribs. All in all, it's really pretty simple. There's a lot of little steps and methods and things that you can do in between every other step. But when we pare it down to the basics, we're talking about seasoning that meat with a spice rub, smoking it or baking it at a relatively low temperature, about 250 degrees, for quite a long time. Cook them at 250 until the internal temp is 200. And you're going to have some great ribs that nobody's going to complain about. But in the smoker, you get a little smokiness. The sauce step gives you a little sweetness and sauciness. To me, that's worth the little bit of extra effort to get a lot more flavor. But do it however you want. Oven, smoker, sauce, no sauce. And just make sure you wrap them up and let them rest for a while before you dare start cutting into them. And if you've never made ribs before and you saw this video and tried the method that I showed here, please come back and comment and tell me how it went and how you thought they tasted. Anyway, that's about it for now. Be sure to like and subscribe and stay up to date with all our latest stuff, including future smoking and barbecue videos. And consider supporting us on Patreon at patreon.com/Great Lakes Country. Thanks for watching, and until next time, I'm John, and this is Great Lakes Country.